No, 20 minutes. Well, it won't even be 20 minutes. Very quickly, the Mount of Olives on which we stand is significant for three things. Number one, it's the place that Yeshua ascended from, Acts chapter 1. And remember what was said? Ye men of Galilee, why are you looking up into the sky? This man is coming back just as you saw him leave. So that means number two, the Mount of Olives is the place where the Lord will return. Zechariah 14 verse 4, his feet will touch the Mount of Olives and the Mount of Olives will split. So we don't believe in a spiritual coming of Christ, Yeshua. We believe in a literal coming of Christ. And then the third reason that this place is so significant is it's here he delivered his address that we call the Olivet Discourse. I asked some of my students one time, why do we call it the Olivet Discourse? And someone raised their hand and says, because we get all of it. And no, that's not the right answer. This was given from the Mount of Olives. And this is what preceded this discourse, Matthew 23, 37 through 39, as Yeshua is speaking to first century Israel. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her, how often I long to gather her children together the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were unwilling. Now, the verb here for gather is episunago. And does anybody know what word we get from that verb, sunago? What does it sound like? Synagogue. Jewish gathering. In other words, Yeshua came the first time to Israel and he says, I wanted to have synagogue with you. But the problem wasn't me. The problem was you. You were unwilling. So he says, behold, your house is left to you desolate. What's the house? It's the temple. And it's sort of interesting that he always referred to the temple as my Father's house. But now they've kicked him out of the house. And so he says, now it's your house. You see that? It says, behold, your house is left to you desolate, speaking of the cycles of discipline that would happen in AD 70, where the Romans would destroy the city and the sanctuary. Now, if I were a replacement theologian, and I didn't believe God had any future for the nation of Israel, I would stop reading at verse 38. But verse 38 is followed by verse 39, right? At least the horns are honking as an amen to me there. Verse 39, he says, for I say to you, from now on, you will not see me. Now, here's a very important word, until you say, and we've heard the Hebrew of this many, many times on this trip, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. That's Psalm 118, verse 26. Yeshua is not coming back for this nation until they acknowledge him as the Messiah. See that? The leadership. And you ask, well, how is that going to happen? Well, Matthew 23, where that statement is found, is followed by what?
Matthew 24.
Not a trick question. Matthew 24, which is the Olivet Discourse, where he outlines the circumstances through which Israel nationally will come to faith in Yeshua, and he will return and gather them, episunago, have synagogue with them, just as he wanted to the first time, and establish his kingdom through them. So it's preceded by some questions. Just a couple of highlights while we're here, even though it's cold, I realize. Matthew 24, verse 1, Yeshua came from the temple and was going away when his disciples came up, pointing out the temple buildings. And he said to them, do you see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left on another, which will not be torn down. That's speaking of AD 70. And that's literally what happened 40 years later. In fact, we're probably going to go on this tour to see remnants of this. But the temple caught on fire. And the gold began to ooze down between the bricks, and it dried there. And what did the greedy Roman soldiers do to get their hands on that dried gold? They had to take the temple apart brick by brick, exactly like Yeshua said. This prophecy was fulfilled 40 years later. Now, if the short-term prophecy happened, do you think the rest of Matthew 24 is going to happen? We got a pretty good probability. Amen.
Amen.
So they want to know, as he was sitting there, verse 3, sitting on the Mount of Olives, where we are, the disciples came to him privately. It's probably more of a conversation than a discourse. The Sermon on the Mount is like a formal sermon, but this is more of a conversation. As he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" And in their minds, the destruction of the temple involved the end of the age. So he says, "Okay, I'll answer your question. I'll talk to you about the end of the age, and I'll talk to you about the circumstances through which national Israel will be converted to Yeshua." And that's the whole subject matter of the Olivet Discourse. So verses 4 through 14, see how fast I'm going through this now? I realize you're all cold, are the birth pains. Birth pangs lead up to a birth. The birth of what? The birth of the kingdom, which has to come to the earth through the nation of Israel, because Israel is the covenanted nation. So just as a woman in labor, the birth pangs get more and more intense and shorter and shorter and shorter as you move closer and closer to the time period of the birth. That's how these birth pains work. They get more and more intense and closer together until the birth of the kingdom through Israel. And if you cross-reference Revelation 6 with these birth pains, you'll see a one-to-one parallel. The seal judgments line up with the birth pains. And then, jumping down to verse 15, he explains what's going to happen in the middle of the tribulation period. Now, this is after the church has been removed via the rapture. Amen?
Amen.
Verse 15, he says, am I with the right group here? This is not the post-trib group. This is the pre-trib group. All right, I want to make sure I'm with the right crowd here. Verse 15, he says, "Therefore when you, Israel, see the abomination of desolation which was spoken through the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand." So right smack dab in the middle of the tribulation period, the Antichrist, who Israel has been trusting in up to this point, betrays them by desecrating their own temple. And it's at that point the blinders start to break off the eyes of the nation. And they begin to recognize that their Messiah is not the Antichrist. Their Messiah is Yeshua, who came 2,000 years ago. One of the great pieces of theology I've ever received is the fellow that led me to Christ. He said, God knocks us down so we look up. Does that happen to anybody?
Yeah.
That's going to happen to Israel. This is the mechanism through which he's going to bring them to himself. And then he says, when that happens, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. They've got to get out of Dodge, because who's chasing them? The Antichrist. And according to Revelation 12, Satan loses his access to heaven at this point. And I believe he actually enters the beast through a possession. And he begins to wage an all-out war against Israel. And Yeshua goes on and he says, whoever is on the housetop, he must not go down. Whoever's on the housetop, he must not go down to get the things that are in the house. Whoever is in the field must not turn back to get his cloak, but woe to those who are pregnant and nursing babies in those days. And then he says, but pray that your flight will not take place on the winter or on the Sabbath, the Shabbat, because as we all know from those Shabbat elevators, right, the nation doesn't work on the Sabbath. So this flight is going to be very difficult. Pray that it doesn't take place in a certain time of the year where it's too cold, like right now, for example. It's going to be difficult for women that are pregnant during this time. And pray that it doesn't take place on the Shabbat. And then verse 21, he says, for there will be great tribulation such as not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will, unless those days had been cut short, no life would be saved, but for the sake of the elect, now who's the elect? National Israel. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. And so what he's saying is they're going to go through this time of tremendous distress. Yet through it, a remnant is going to be saved. And it's going to take this type of ordeal for Yeshua to bring the nation of Israel to himself. And then what happens at the end of the tribulation period, getting ready to wrap up here, believe it or not, verses 29 through 31, what does he say? But immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and then all of the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. Why are the tribes mourning? Because they're recognizing that the Antichrist, who just ripped them off and betrayed them by desecrating their temple, is not their Messiah. Their Messiah is Yeshua, who they had a chance to embrace 2,000 years ago but rejected. And now he's describing the circumstances through which this nation that has a covenant with God is going to be converted. And I'll just end here with verse 31. It's very important to get to verse 31. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet. This is not the rapture. The rapture has already happened at least 7 years before. Look at what it says here. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will what? Gather together his elect. Who's the elect? Israel. Gather together his elect from the four winds of the sky to the other. See that word gather? What's the verb there? Episunago, where we get the word synagogue. That's the same word we saw at the end of chapter 23. And he's saying, I wanted to have synagogue with you when I came the first time, but the problem wasn't me, the problem was you. You wouldn't have me. And so now he begins to outline Israel's farewell address in chapter 24, which is the circumstances by which the nation, under a time of great ordeal and betrayal by the Antichrist, is going to be brought to saving faith. And once the nation is brought to saving faith, you move over to chapter 25, verse 31, and it says, but when the Son of Man comes in his glory and with his angels, he will sit on his glorious throne. What throne would that be? Anybody know? David's throne. It's what's promised in the Davidic covenant. 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 12 through 16. So I don't know. I'm excited. I'm cold, but I'm excited. Why am I excited? Because God has a plan for the church, but he also has a plan for Israel. And the whole future for the nation was outlined in this very location. And so let's just praise the Lord. Let's close in a word of prayer. Father, we are grateful for this discourse. We're grateful for